And the responses that I was delivering were coming from Ahmed Jabari, the strongman of Hamas who was holding Gilad Shalit, through my colleague Razi Hamad. And the Israeli side was blown away, because for years when they delivered messages and tried to get responses from Jabari, it would take days and weeks and sometimes months, and now they were getting responses within an hour. And David said, this is serious, let's check it. And they checked it and they verified that my messages being delivered to them were coming back, being delivered exactly as they were being given. And they have the ways of checking it. And when I called up Nader al-Asser, the general from the Egyptian intelligence service, who was now back in Cairo and head of the Israeli Palestine desk of the Egyptian intelligence, and I tell Nader that Razi Hamad and I have renewed our contacts and we're speaking every day, Nader laughs at me on the phone and says, Gershon, you're speaking at least 5 times a day, we're all listening. Well, we began checking the channel, verifying it, making contact with Nader in Egypt, as I said. Once again, David wanted me to ask to get a sign of life, that there had been no sign of life since September 2009. It was time for another sign of life. Ahmed Jabari was insistent that there would be no sign of life, only after negotiations began, because he said last time we gave it, there was no progress. So after trying to get a sign of life and Israel making all kinds of promises in return for a sign of life, we were hitting a dead end. I proposed we moved to talk about the negotiations themselves. And David suggested that we talk about modalities. How should we conduct the negotiations? Direct emails, chats, SMSs, Skype negotiations. Razi Hamad and I would begin our morning with a chat on MSN Chat. We would speak all throughout the day on the telephone. I proposed to Razi Hamad that at this point, what we needed to do in order to be successful was to view ourselves not as adversaries in a negotiation, but as a team working together to solve the problem. That if he and I could be in the middle with the official Israelis and the official Hamas people over here, we could propose solutions and breakthroughs that would enable an agreement, because the primary element that was missing here was any element of trust. And Razi Hamad and I, after 5 years of being in contact with each other, having thousands of phone calls and conversations between us, had become friends. We had a base of trust between us. And he agreed, and he liked the idea, and that's the way we proceeded in coming up with proposals and ideas to advance the negotiations forward. We created this team, and we started working on a document of principles for the negotiations. The German negotiator had created categories. Hamas had demanded that prisoners be released from all elements of Palestinian society, from West Bank, from Gaza, from East Jerusalem, from Israeli Arabs, what they called 1948 Arabs, from Hamas, from Fatah, from Popular Front, from all the political movements, sick people, women, minors, people who had served the longest prison sentences. These are the categories. The German negotiator, and this really blew me away when I heard this, had created a category which was the most difficult category, those terrorists who had killed the most amount of Israelis. You know what he called them? The VIPs. The VIP category was the most difficult category, but at the beginning of the negotiations, what became very difficult was that they kept demanding that Israel agree to release 1948 Arabs. In other words, Palestinians, Arabs who were citizens of Israel, committed acts of terror. There were 7 people like this in prison who were all convicted murderers who had been sitting in Israeli prison for more than 20 years. Hamas demanded they be included. David Meidan kept telling me that Israel rejects having any of its citizens included in a prison exchange, and that Dr. Conrad had dealt with this issue in Annex 13 of the German proposal. That was really curious to me. Annex 13 of the German proposal dealt with Israeli Arabs. Well, one evening, sitting with the Israeli team at a restaurant, trying to understand the German proposal, I said to them, tell me about Annex 13. And they explained that it would be after the deal and they would be released by a pardon of the president. And I said, those details don't really concern me. Tell me, how many annexes were there in the German proposal? And they told me 15. And I said, how long was this German proposal? And they said, 50 pages. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did this German negotiator think that Ahmed Jabri, the head of the military wing of Hamas, has a legal department? He can take this document and analyze it. Was he negotiating a merger between Daimler-Benz and Siemens? This was a prisoner exchange, to which I said, this document cannot be longer than 5 or 6 pages. Now I understood what happened when Ahmed Jabri received this book. He looked at it and he said, this is an Israeli document. He didn't even look at it. He tore it up. He threw Conrad out, who he accused of working for the Israelis. He threw out Mahmoud al-Zahar, who said he was a conspirator with Conrad working with the Israelis. And for 2 years, there was no negotiations because of this book. Well, Ghazi Hamid and I began working on this Declaration of Principles. It was a very tough negotiation. It went through 7 iterations, and then on July 14th, my daughter's birthday, document number 7 arrived, which was the breakthrough document. The most important thing of this document, 2 things, was that Hamas agreed to compromise on every single category. Basically, what Ghazi Hamid and I did after finally disclosing the real positions of Hamas, something that he got in big trouble with Ahmed Jabri afterwards for doing, is that I proposed we take the Israeli position, the Hamas position, we agree on the midpoint exactly, we write this up as the final document of principles, and as David Meidan insisted, that the document be entitled the final proposal for closing the deal. It had to say finality. It had to be closure. This was the end of the deal, and on July 14th in the evening, David Meidan took this document to Netanyahu. By the way, from May until this period, there were 7 people in Israel, in addition to my family, who knew about the secret channel. Netanyahu had given the authorization to David Meidan to run the secret back channel through me and Ghazi Hamid. On July 14th in Israel, in the evening, Netanyahu gave David Meidan the green light to close the deal on the basis of this document. But then, on August 18th, when the intensive negotiations started going over the list of names, a terrorist attack took place over Sinai. A bus was hit, 12 Israelis were killed. Israel launched a preemptive attack against the Popular Resistance Committees in Gaza. 6 leaders of the Popular Resistance Committee in Gaza were killed. The Islamic Jihad and the Resistance Committees began shooting rockets into Israel. We have a full-fledged rocket war going on between Israel and Gaza now. And of course, no negotiations going on. We're also in the midst of Jewish holidays. I spend the next 72 hours on the phone trying to work out a ceasefire. As opposed to when I did it in the past, now every message I got from Hamas was being transferred to the Prime Minister, the Chief of Staff, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet. Everyone official in Israel was getting my messages that were coming from Hamas. The attack was on a Thursday. By Saturday evening, I had proposed a midnight ceasefire. There was no response. Midnight came and went. There was more shooting. By the next morning, the representative of the UN Secretary General, Robert Sari, got involved. He was in Cairo trying to tie the strings together. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I received word from the United Nations that an agreement for a ceasefire had been worked out, but neither side would agree to announce it. The UN would not announce it either because they would not take responsibility for the agreement that both sides had to take responsibility for. I knew that if we didn't have a ceasefire, we were going to go on for another day or two. The worst thing that could happen is that a serious number of people are going to be killed, and then we would end the Shalit negotiations as well as having a full-fledged war once again. Those rockets that fall usually don't hit anything, the Hamas rockets. Hamas wasn't shooting, by the way. It was Islamic Jihad and the popular committees. Hamas wasn't shooting any rockets, but one of those rockets could hit a school bus, God forbid, or a kindergarten, or a supermarket. It could do real damage, and then we're in real big trouble, beyond the fact of all these people getting killed who didn't have to be killed. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, I decided out of a frustration that I was going to announce a ceasefire. And what I did is I started texting my friends in the Israeli media. the correspondents on Arab Affairs, and told them that there was an agreement between Israel and Hamas for a 9 o'clock ceasefire. At 7:20, Ehud Yari from Channel 2 News, who's one of the most respected journalists in Israel, reported an agreement from my text message of a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. By 7:30, the entire Israeli media was reporting a ceasefire. At 7:30 in Arabic, Al Jazeera announced that there's a ceasefire. The problem is that a few minutes, it's not over. A few minutes after 9 o'clock, 4 rockets fall in Ofakim, and I receive a phone call from Miki Eitan, a minister from the Likud, who I had let known that I was doing these talks because I had asked him originally to speak to David Meidan on my behalf so that he would take me seriously. So Miki Eitan is in Netanyahu's office, and he calls me and says, Bibi wants to know, where's your ceasefire? So I call up the Hamas Prime Minister's office, and all the heads of all the factions are there, including Ahmed Jabri, who says that he's ready to send out his troops to enforce the ceasefire, but they want a green light that Israel's not going to shoot at them. So I call up David. David tells me to send it as a text message. He wants to send it to the Chief of Staff. He sends it to the Chief of Staff, Benny Gantz. I get back an announcement 10 minutes later, tell the Hamas people to send out the troops. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Islamic Jihad announced that they were adhering to the ceasefire. We were back on schedule. But we had Jewish holidays ahead of us, which slowed everything down. Yom Kippur ended. David Meidan came back from Egypt just before Yom Kippur with an initial agreement. They were going back after Yom Kippur to complete the final details of the agreement. On the morning of October 10th, David sent me an SMS saying that we would meet on the 11th in Tel Aviv in the afternoon. So I had scheduled meetings in Tel Aviv. I went to Tel Aviv and I waited for a phone call from him. It didn't come. I sent him SMS messages. I'm in Tel Aviv. What time are we going to meet? Where are we going to meet? David always responded immediately, whether it was 2 o'clock in the morning or 12 in the noontime. He always responded, except if he was sitting with Netanyahu or if he was in Egypt. He didn't respond, and he didn't respond. And I sent him more messages, and I got no response, and I called him, and his phone was closed. At 7 o'clock, there was an announcement in Israel that Netanyahu had called an emergency session of the cabinet to vote on the Shalit deal. I got in my car, ran up to Jerusalem. The government voted yes to the deal. 26 ministers voted yes. 3 ministers voted against. This was amazing. 1,027 Palestinian terrorists were being released for 1 Israeli soldier. 26 members of the Israeli government, including Netanyahu, voted yes for the deal. 80% of the Israeli public supported the deal. This was unbelievable, unbelievable. I was amazed, and of course I was wrong about Netanyahu.